The secret to understanding why the finest military minds of the 20th century, men like Erich von Manstein, Heinz Guderian, and Gerd von Rundstedt, ultimately failed, begins with a fundamental and irreconcilable cultural system. The German officer corps was a product of the Prussian military tradition, a caste of aristocrats who viewed warfare as a refined, mathematical science. They were the heirs to Moltke and trained in der Kriegsakademie to value operational flexibility, or Auftraggeist. However, when Adolf Hitler rose to power, this centuries-old institution collided with a leader who viewed war not as a science, but as an act of raw, fanatical will. The generals were experts in the possible, while Hitler was an extremist of the impossible. This tension created a structural paralysis within the German high command that was present even during the stunning victories of 1939 and 1940. The secret reality of the Blitzkrieg was that it succeeded despite the chaos at the top, not because of a unified command. Hitler, whom the aristocratic generals derisively called the Bohemian corporal behind closed doors, deeply distrusted the traditional military elite. He viewed their caution as cowardice and their professional skepticism as treason. To neutralize their influence, Hitler created a redundant and overlapping command structure. TOK W Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and TOK H Oberkommando des Heeres. By pitting these two organizations against each other, Hitler ensured that no single general could ever challenge his authority. But in doing so, he effectively decapitated the strategic coherence of the Reich. As the planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union began in late 1940, this command friction turned into a strategic cancer. The generals of the OKH, led by Franz Holder, wanted a focused, traditional offensive aimed at capturing Moscow, the heart of the Soviet transport and political system. Hitler, however, was obsessed with economic and ideological prizes, the grain of Ukraine and the oil of the Caucasus, because the generals were legally bound by their oath of personal loyalty to Hitler on oath, taken in 1934, that replaced their loyalty to the Constitution. They found themselves unable to resist his increasingly erratic interference. Professionalism was surrendered to a cult of personality, and the results would be catastrophic. The secret tragedy of the German general staff was their own moral cowardice. While they were brilliant tacticians on the battlefield, they were politically illiterate. They believed they could use Hitler to rebuild the German military and then discard him. Instead, Hitler used their brilliance to conquer Europe and then discarded them when his delusions began to fail. By the time the German tanks reached the outskirts of Moscow in the winter of 1941, the command structure was a hornet's nest of rivalries and fear. Every major decision had to be cleared through the Wolf's Lair, where Hitler's intuition was prioritized over the cold, hard data of his logistics officers. The generals were no longer commanders. They were merely high-ranking clerks, executing the whims of a man who had never commanded more than a squad in the trenches of the First World War. The greatest secret weapon of the German military since the 19th century was not a specific tank or aircraft, but a command philosophy known as Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactic. This doctrine empowered subordinate commanders to make independent decisions based on the fluid reality of the battlefield, provided they fulfilled the higher commander's intent. It was the soul of the Blitzkrieg. However, as the war on the Eastern Front intensified in Adolf Hitler began to view this professional independence as a direct threat to his absolute control. The man who had once praised the daring of his generals now sought to turn them into static executioners of his hold at all costs. Policy. This shift reached a breaking point during the winter of 1941 and the spring of 1940, when the Soviet counteroffensive outside Moscow threatened to shatter the exhausted Hitler issued his infamous halt order. He forbade any retreat, regardless of the tactical situation. While some historians argue this saved the army from a Napoleonic rout in the snow, it set a lethal precedent. Hitler concluded that his will was superior to the professional retreat strategies of his generals. From that moment on, the German generals lost their most vital tool. Maneuver. The professional experts in mobile warfare were now shackled to maps in the Wolf's Lair, forced to defend indefensible positions simply because Hitler refused to yield a single kilometer of scorched earth. The psychological impact on commanders like Heinz Guderian, the father of the Panzer divisions, was devastating. In late 1941, Guderian was dismissed for ordering a tactical withdrawal to save his men from insurrection. This sent a chilling message through the officer corps. Professional competence was no longer a shield against Hitler's wrath. By the time the summer offensive of 1942, Case Blue was launched toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad, the generals were operating in a state of constant fear. Hitler began to micromanage the movement of individual battalions from thousands of miles away, ignoring the desperate warnings from his intelligence officers about the growing Soviet reserves. The secret disaster of Stalingrad was not just a failure of logistics, but a failure of command courage. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, was a brilliant staff officer, but lacked the Prussian defiance to disobey a catastrophic order. When the Soviets launched Operation Uranus in November 1942, encircling over 250,000 German and Axis troops, Paulus had a window of opportunity to break out. His generals begged him to move. However, Hitler's command from the Obersalzberg was absolute: stand and fight. Paulus, bound by his oath and his fear of the Führer, chose obedience over the survival of his army. The secret of the German defeat at Stalingrad was that the finest army in the Reich was sacrificed not by enemy brilliance alone, but by a command structure that had criminalized tactical common sense. By the end of 1942, the German officer corps was a fractured institution. The traditionalists like Erich von Manstein attempted to save the front through backhand blows and elastic defense, but they were constantly undermined by Hitler's refusal to authorize the necessary withdrawals. The genius of the German general was being systematically neutralized by a political leadership that viewed every tactical retreat as a moral failure. The Wehrmacht was no longer a rapier. It was becoming a heavy, blunted club, being slowly chipped away by a Soviet enemy that was, ironically, learning the very lessons of flexibility that Hitler was forcing his own generals to forget. By the spring of 1943, the German High Command had entered a state of terminal dysfunction. Following the catastrophe at Stalingrad, a brief window of opportunity appeared for the Wehrmacht to stabilize the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably the most gifted operational mind in the Reich, had performed a miracle at Kharkov, proving that elastic defense and mobile counterstrikes could still defeat the Soviet steamroller. However, the secret tragedy of 1943 was that Hitler, stung by the humiliation of the previous winter, was no longer interested in Manstein's brilliant retreats. He was obsessed with a massive, prestige-driven offensive that would regain the initiative. Operation Citadel. The planning for the Battle of Kursk revealed the fatal flaw in the German command's inability to manage its own leader. General Kurt Seitzler, the chief of staff of the OKH, proposed a quick surgical strike against the Kursk salient, to be launched in May. But Hitler, captivated by the promise of new wonder weapons like the Panther and Tiger tanks, delayed the offensive month after month. He ignored the warnings from his intelligence officers that every day of delay allowed the Soviets to build the most formidable defensive system in the history of warfare. By the time the panzers finally rolled forward in July 19, the secret of the attack was known to every private in the Red Army. The German generals were forced to lead their men into a literal meat grinder, knowing that the element of surprise, the very heart of German tactical doctrine, had been thrown away by a man in a bunker in East Prussia. This period also marked the peak of the administrative civil war between the OKW Armed Forces High Command and the OKH Army High Command. This was Hitler's secret method of divide and rule. The OKH was responsible for the Eastern Front, while the OK, led by the subservient Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, managed all other theaters, including North Africa, Italy, and the burgeoning threat in the West. This meant that the German military had no unified strategic center. Resources, reinforcements, and intelligence were hoarded by one headquarters at the expense of the other. When the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, Hitler used the crisis to cancel Operation Citadel at the very moment it might have achieved a breakthrough. The generals in the East were left stranded, their reserves diverted to a different theater governed by a different set of bureaucrats. Furthermore, the secret breakdown of the relationship between Hitler and his commanders was now irreparable. Hitler began to rely more on his court favorites, politically loyal but militarily incompetent figures, like Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, rather than his professional staff. He began to distrust the very maps presented to him often shouting that his generals were lying about the numbers of Soviet tanks and divisions. The genius of the German general staff was now being spent on trying to manipulate Hitler's moods rather than defeating the enemy. Commanders spent more time in long, exhausting briefings at the Berghof or the Wolfschanze than they did at the front, leading to a leadership vacuum where critical operational decisions were delayed by days while waiting for the Führer's personal authorization. By the end of 1943, the German generals realized they were no longer fighting for victory, but for time. The loss of the Mediterranean, the collapse of Italy, and the relentless advance of the Red Army created a strategic encirclement that no amount of tactical brilliance could break. The secret realization that gripped men like Manstein and Guderian was that they were serving a man who would rather see the entire German nation destroyed than admit a single military error. The professional warriors of Prussia were now the servants of a nihilistic cult. And as they looked toward the coming year of they knew that the defense of the Reich was becoming a suicide pact. By the spring of 1944, the secret paralysis of the German High Command had reached a state of terminal decay. The impending Allied invasion of Western Europe, known as Operation Overlord, highlighted the disastrous consequences of Hitler's divided command structure. In France, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, were locked in a bitter strategic dispute. Rommel, having experienced the crushing weight of Allied air power in North Africa, insisted that the panzer divisions be stationed directly on the beaches. Rundstedt, a traditionalist, wanted to keep them in reserve for a massive counterattack once the Allies moved inland. The secret failure was that neither man had the authority to decide. Hitler, in his growing paranoia and obsession with control, imposed a compromise that was a tactical death sentence. He split the panzer divisions between the two commanders, but decreed that the most powerful reserves could only be moved with his express personal permission. On June 6, 1944, as the Allied Armada appeared off the coast of Normandy, the German generals were while the Atlantic Wall was being breached, the elite tank divisions remained stationary for hours, because Hitler was sleeping at his retreat in Berchtesgaden, and his staff was too terrified to wake him. This was the ultimate proof that the German military's legendary speed had been murdered by a bureaucratic dictatorship. The secret tension within the officer corps finally exploded on July 20th, 1944, with the attempt to assassinate Hitler at the Wolf's Lair, led by Colonel Claus von St. The plot was the desperate culmination of years of frustration among officers who realized that Hitler was leading Germany to total annihilation. When the bomb failed to kill the Führer, the secret pact between the military and the Nazi Party was replaced by a reign of terror. Hitler's distrust of the general staff became absolute. He ordered the execution of hundreds of officers, including some of his most capable planners. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, was forced to commit suicide, and the venerable von Kluge followed suit. Following the July 20th plot, Hitler replaced the traditional military salute with the Nazi salute and appointed Heinrich Himmler, a man with zero military experience, as commander of the replacement army. The secret of the final months of 1944 was that loyalty to the Nazi ideology became the only metric for promotion. Professionalism was viewed as a sign of defeatism. Hitler began to appoint National Socialist guidance officers to Eberdi Unit, echoing the Soviet commissar system he had once despised. The German generals who remained were no longer asked for their expert opinions. They were simply told to die where they stood. The final major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge in December 19, was the ultimate example of this fantasy command. Hitler designed the entire operation himself, setting objectives that his generals knew were logistically impossible. He demanded the capture of Antwerp, with an army that lacked enough fuel to even reach the Meuse River. When Field Marshals Model and Rundstedt proposed a more realistic small solution, Hitler screamed that they were Unimaginatie. The secret realization for the German generals during that freezing winter was that they were no longer fighting a war of strategy, but were participating in the final violent delusions of a dying regime. The German army, once the most flexible and innovative force in the world, had been reduced to a static monument of fanatical obedience, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The secret failure of Hitler's generals was not confined to the battlefield. It was deeply rooted in a catastrophic collapse of military intelligence and a profound underestimation of the Soviet will to power. By the middle of 1942, the German High Command was operating in a fog of its own making. The organization responsible for assessing the Red Army, the Fremde Heere Oosten, Foreign Armies East, led by Reinhard Gehlen, was caught in a lethal trap. If they provided accurate numbers regarding the staggering Soviet industrial output and manpower reserves, they were accused of defeatism by Hitler. If they softened the numbers to please the fewer, they were providing a blueprint for suicide. The secret reality of the Eastern Front was that the German generals were fighting a ghost war, making decisions based on maps that bore no resemblance to the terrifying reality of the Russian steppes. The most egregious example of this failure occurred during the planning for the 1942 summer offensive, Operation Blue. Hitler and his generals, including the chief of the General Staff Franz Haupt, shared a secret, arrogant belief that the Soviet Union was one good blow away from total collapse. They looked at the millions of Soviet prisoners taken in 1941 and concluded that the Red Army had run out of men. They were blind to the secret industrial migration beyond the Ural Mountains, where Soviet factories were producing thousands of T-34 tanks in conditions of absolute secrecy. This intelligence vacuum allowed Hitler to split his forces, sending Army Group A to the Caucasus and Army Group B to Stalingrad, a decision that violated every principle of military concentration. The generals, despite their misgivings, failed to provide a unified front of opposition to this lunacy, because they themselves were infected by the myth of their own racial and professional superiority. Furthermore, the secret war of signals was being lost in the shadows. While the Germans believed their Enigma codes were unbreakable, the Allies and the Soviets, through the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland and the Red Orchestra in Berlin, were often reading the German orders before the field commanders received them. The German generals, in their traditional Prussian hubris, dismissed the possibility that their superior technology could be compromised. This meant that every brilliant maneuver planned by Manstein or Guderian was being countered by a Soviet high command stavka that was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The secret of the German failure was that they were playing a high-stakes chess match against an opponent who could see all their pieces through a mirror. By 1943, the War of the Maps had become a theater of the absurd. Hitler began to create paper divisions units that existed only in his imagination or as depleted remnants with no tanks and no fuel. When his generals tried to explain that a specific division had only 20% of its combat strength remaining, Hitler would shout that they were hiding resources from him. The secret psychological collapse of the High Command was complete. The generals began to lie to Hitler to stay in his favor, and Hitler lied to himself to maintain his grip on reality. This created a feedback loop of delusion. The genius of the German General Staff was now spent on creative accounting, trying to move non-existent battalions to plug gaps in a front line that was thousands of kilometers long. This intelligence failure was compounded by the total lack of coordination with Germany's allies. The secret contempt that the German generals felt for the Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian armies led to a complete lack of strategic integration. They used these Allied troops to guard the long, exposed flanks of the German thrusts as senates without providing them with the necessary anti-tank weapons or logistical support. When these flanks inevitably collapsed under Soviet pressure, the German generals blamed foreign cowardice rather than their own strategic negligence. The secret of the best generals was that they were excellent at winning battles, but utterly incompetent at managing a coalition war. They were masters of the tactical moment, bat slaves to a strategic void that was now swallowing the entire Wehrmacht hall. The most guarded secret of the German General Staff, and perhaps their greatest professional sin, was their systematic refusal to acknowledge the logistical impossible. In the Prussian tradition, the Generalquartieris Quartermaster General was often treated as a secondary figure to the Generalstab Chief of Staff. This cultural bias created a secret fatal flaw. The German generals planned operations based on what their tanks could achieve in a day, but rarely on what their supply trucks could deliver in a week. By the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht was attempting to maintain a front line that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the shores of the Black Sea, using a logistical system that was still, in many ways, rooted in the 19th century. While the world was captivated by images of the panzer divisions, the secret reality was that 80% of the German army relied on horse-drawn transport. The mathematics of attrition was brutal. A single infantry division required hundreds of tons of supplies every day just to remain combat effective. On the vast, roadless steppes of the Soviet Union, the German logistics chain was stretched to a literal breaking point. The secret failure of the generals was their strategic optimism, the belief that the war would be won so quickly that a long-term logistical plan was unnecessary. When the lightning war turned into a war of attrition, the German generals found themselves presiding over an army that was eating its own horses to survive while its tanks sat idle for lack of fuel. The most critical secret of the Reich's failure was the oil equation. Adolf Hitler's obsession with the oil fields of Makov and Baku in the Caucasus was not just a megalomaniac's whim, it was a desperate response to a terrifying reality. Germany had no domestic source of natural oil, relying instead on synthetic fuel produced from coal process that was expensive, slow, and highly vulnerable to Allied bombing. The German generals, however, failed to integrate this fuel reality into their operational planning. They designed massive encirclement maneuvers that consumed millions of gallons of fuel, only to find that they could not consolidate their gains because the supply trucks had run dry hundreds of miles to the rear. The genius of Manstein and Kleist was being fueled by a mirage. Furthermore, the German industrial boutique system was a secret disaster for the men at the front. Unlike the United States, which focused on the mass production of standardized vehicles like the Sherman tank or the Dusseldorf truck, the German military suffered from an absurd over-engineering of their equipment. By 1943, the German army was operating dozens of different types of trucks, each requiring specialized spare parts and highly trained mechanics. When a Tiger tank broke down in the middle of a Soviet offensive, it often had to be abandoned because the specific transmission part needed was in a warehouse in Berlin, not in a field depot in Ukraine. The generals failed to demand industrial simplicity, preferring quality over quantity in a war where quantity had a quality of its own. The secret psychological toll of this logistical collapse was a profound sense of operational betrayal among the junior officers and soldiers. They saw their brilliant commanders ordering them to advance into the cauldron without winter clothing, without enough ammunition, and with food rations that were being cut by half every month. The German High Command, in its aristocratic isolation, continued to move pins on maps as if they represented fresh, fully equipped divisions, when in reality, they were mubbing paper armies of exhausted, frostbitten men who were out of shells. The secret of Hitler's generals was that they had built a Ferrari of an army, but they had tried to drive it across a continent-sized desert without a gas station in sight. As the strategic situation worsened throughout 1943 and 1944, a secret and dangerous delusion took root within the German High Command. The belief in the Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons. Adolf Hitler, always prone to grandiosity, became convinced that a single technological breakthrough could reverse the tide of the war. The secret tragedy of the German generals was that many of them, desperate for any alternative to the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front, allowed themselves to be seduced by this mirage. They began to divert billions of Reichsmarks and millions of man-hours away from the production of standard tanks, artillery, and ammunition into exotic, unproven projects that would ultimately have zero impact on the outcome of the conflict. The most famous of these projects were the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket. While these were marvels of engineering, the V-2 being the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, secret of their failure lay in their staggering cost-to-effect ratio. The V-2 program alone cost more than the Manhattan Project did for the United States, yet it delivered a smaller explosive payload than a single mid-sized Allied bombing raid. The German generals, specifically those in the Oki, failed to realize that they were trading the steel of the army for firecrackers of the atmosphere. The price of the V-2 program, Germany could have produced thousands of extra fighter planes or Panzer for tanks, which might have actually slowed the Allied advance across France or Poland. This obsession with technological miracles extended to the battlefield as well. Hitler's generals became complicit in the development of heavy tank monsters, like the Jag Tiger and the Maus, a 1-100-80-8-ton behemoth that was so heavy it could not cross any bridge in Europe. The secret failure of these designs was their complete lack of operational mobility. A tank that cannot move is merely a bunker. And in the fluid, fast-paced warfare of the late 20th century, these steel giants were easily bypassed and destroyed by Allied air power or Soviet infantry. The generals, who should have been the voice of practical military experience, often encouraged these designs, hoping for a magical shield that would protect their men from the overwhelming numbers of the enemy. The secret psychological impact of this Wunderwaffen rhetoric was a slow poisoning of the German chain of command. Junior officers and soldiers were told to hold on because a secret weapon was coming to save them. This created a culture of false hope that delayed the realization of defeat and led to the unnecessary deaths of hundreds of thousands of men in the final months of the war. Meanwhile, the jet fighter program, which actually had the potential to challenge Allied air superiority, was crippled by Hitler's secret and erratic demand that it be used as a Blitzbomber rather than an interceptor. The generals, once again, found themselves unable to provide a unified, professional front against this tactical absurdity. By 1945, the secret of the German wonder weapons was out. They were the last gasp of a regime that had run out of fuel, pilots, and sanity. The brilliant scientists and engineers of the Reich were working on intercontinental bombers and orbital mirrors, while the German infantry was being slaughtered because they lacked basic anti-tank guns and medical supplies. The generals had allowed the science of war to be replaced by the science fiction of a madman. The genius of the German command was now a prisoner of its own technological hubris, waiting for a mechanical miracle that would never arrive, while the reality of the Russian and American steel was already at their gates. A fundamental and secret flaw in the German high command during the years of 1941 and 1942 was its inability to grasp the concept of global strategy. The German generals were, by training and temperament, continentalists. They viewed the world through the lens of land warfare on the European plain. To then, the Mediterranean was a distraction, an unfortunate obligation created by the military incompetence of their Italian ally, Benito Mussolini. This secret lack of interest in the southern flank would ultimately allow the British and later the Americans to gain a foothold that would tear the underbelly of the Reich open. The most famous figure of this theater, General Laderfield, Marshal Irwin, the Desert Fox, became the personification of this strategic schizophrenia. Rommel was a brilliant tactical opportunist, but he was a logistical nightmare for the OK. The secret struggle within the German command was that Rommel was constantly demanding more tanks, more fuel, and more men for an offensive toward the Suez Canal resources that Hitler and the OKH had already earmarked for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The German generals in Berlin viewed Rommel as a glory seeker, who was wasting precious panzer divisions in a desert that had no strategic value to the final victory over Russia. The secret failure of the Mediterranean campaign was the German refusal to seize the island of Malta. This tiny British outpost sat directly on the supply lines of the Afrika Korps, while the German Fallschirmjäger Heer paratroopers were the finest elite light infantry in the world. Hitler, scarred by the heavy losses during the invasion of Crete in 1940, forbade any further large-scale airborne operations. This secret cowardice at the top meant that Malta remained a stationary aircraft carrier for the Royal Navy. By late 1942, over 70% of the supplies intended for Rommel were being sent to the bottom of the sea. The genius of Rommel was being strangled by a logistics chain that the High Command in Berlin refused to protect or prioritize. Furthermore, when the inevitable collapse came at El Alamein in November 1942, the German generals were once again paralyzed by Hitler's no-retreat orders. Instead of allowing Rommel to conduct a masterful fighting withdrawal to Tunisia, Hitler demanded that he stand and die. When the Allies launched Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa, the German High Command was caught completely by surprise. They had failed to invest in long-range maritime reconnaissance, and their secret intelligence services had dismissed the possibility of a major American landing so far from Europe. The result? was the Tunisgrad of May 1943, where over 250,000 veteran German and Italian troops were forced to surrender, a loss of manpower equivalent to the disaster it started. But often forgotten in the shadow of the Eastern Front, the secret psychological impact of the Mediterranean failure was the rotting of the southern flank. After the fall of Sicily in July 19, the German generals were forced to divert dozens of first-rate divisions from the Eastern Front to the Italian peninsula. The best generals now found themselves fighting a static, brutal war in the Apennine Mountains, wasting their mobile reserves in a theater that could never win the war, but was effectively losing it. The secret of the Mediterranean trap was that the Allies had successfully forced the German military to fight on a third front that Hitler's generals had never wanted and for which they had no long-term plan. The rising tide of Allied power was now washing over the shores of Europe, and the German High Command was drowning in its own lack of global vision. One of the most profound and secret failures of the German military machine was the total breakdown of cooperation between the army here and the Air Force Luft. In the early years of the war, the world was terrified by the Stuka and the Messerschmitt, but by the Luftwaffe had become a hollow shell. The secret behind this collapse was not just Allied industrial power, but the monumental incompetence and vanity of Hermann Göring, combined with a catastrophic lack of strategic foresight by the German General Staff. The generals of the army, despite their tactical brilliance, failed to demand a unified airland doctrine that could survive a long war, leaving the Wehrmacht to fight its most critical battles under a sky dominated by Allied steel. Hermann Göring, the second most powerful man in the Reich, ran the Luftwaffe as his private fief. He prioritized prestige projects and political loyalty over technical efficiency and pilot training. The secret tragedy of the German air arm was the attrition of the elite. While the British and Americans rotated their veteran pilots back home to train the next generation of flyers, the Luftwaffe kept its aces expert in the air until they were killed or physically broken. This meant that by the middle of 1944, the average German pilot entering combat had less than 100 hours of flight time, compared to over 400 hours for an American pilot. The German generals were ordering their last reserves of fuel to be spent on suicide missiles flown by boys who barely knew how to land their planes. The secret failure of the Luftwaffe's leadership was also reflected in its industrial and technical decisions. Göring and his technical chiefs, like Ernst de Ditt, had failed to develop a heavy, four-engine, strategic bomber, the Eurobomber, believing the war would be won quickly with medium-range tactical planes. This meant that Germany had no way to strike at the Soviet industrial heartland or the American supply ports. When the highly strategic bombing campaign began to level German cities like Hamburg and Dresden in 1943 and the German generals realized too late that they had no roof over their nation. The secret of the air war was that Germany was fighting with its hands tied. They could be hit from above, but they could not hit back at the sources of their enemy's strength. Furthermore, the ego of the Luftwaffe leadership created a secret intelligence black hole. Göring constantly lied to Hitler about the number of operational aircraft and the effectiveness of German air defenses. When the Allied 1,000 bomber raids began, Göring famously claimed they were impossible and that the bombs being reported were actually British propaganda. This forced the army generals to make strategic decisions based on a promise of air cover that never arrived. At the Battle of the Bulge in December 1940, the entire offensive was predicated on the secret hope that a thick fog would ground Allied planes. The moment the weather cleared, the Luftwaffe was nowhere to be found, and the German panzers were slaughtered on the open roads. The final secret of the Luftwaffe's failure was the Me-2-100-and-60-2 disaster. Germany had the world's first operational jet fighter, a machine that could have decimated the Allied bomber formations. However, Hitler's erratic demand to turn it into a bomber, and the bureaucratic infighting between the Luftwaffe and the Ministry of Armaments, led by Albert Speer, delayed its mass deployment by nearly a year. The German generals watched in silent despair as their finest weapon was strangled by red tape and political madness. By 1945, the Luftwaffe had fuel but no pilots, or pilots but no planes. The heirs of Richthofen had been reduced to a ghost force, and the secret of their defeat was a warning to the world. A military that cannot control its own skies has already signed its own surrender. The final and perhaps most enduring secret of the German military collapse was the myth of the spear miracle. In 1942, following the death of Fritz Todt, Hitler appointed his personal architect, Albert Speer, as the Minister of Armaments and War Production for decades. History books suggested that Speer had performed a miracle by tripling German tank and aircraft production between 1943 and 1944, despite the relentless Allied bombing. However, the secret reality hidden in the charred remains of the Reich's ministry was that this miracle was a house of cards. The German generals were receiving more equipment on paper, but they were losing the war of quality, logistics, and fuel at an even faster rate. Speer's secret strategy was rationalization. He forced the German industry, which had previously operated like a collection of artisan workshops, to adopt mass production techniques similar to those of Detroit. But this effort came 3 years too late. While German tank production peaked in 1950, the quality of the steel was deteriorating due to the loss of rare minerals like tungsten and manganese from the east. The secret tragedy for the Panzer commanders was that their new Panther and Tiger tanks were frequently breaking down before they even reached the front lines. The Speer miracle was producing a quantity of steel that the German logistics system could no longer transport, and that the German Luftwaffe could no longer protect. Furthermore, the secret of the German total war was its reliance on the most brutal form of exploitation: slave labor. Under the direction of Speer and Fritz, millions of Ostarbeiter Eastern workers and concentration camp prisoners were forced into the underground factories of the Middle. This was a secret moral and technical rot at the heart of the Reich. Sabotage became a constant, silent weapon against the rockets that failed to launch and tank engines that seized after an hour of use were often the secret legacy of the desperate people forced to build them. The German generals, who viewed themselves as honorable Prussian officers, chose to ignore the fact that their wonder weapons were being built on a foundation of human misery and industrial inefficiency. The secret realization that finally broke the spirit of the High Command in early 1945 was the oil ledger. No matter how many tanks Speer's factories produced, Germany had no fuel to move them. The Allied oil campaign had destroyed the synthetic fuel plants at Luna and Politz. The secret of the final battles in the West and East was that the German generals were ordering mobile counterattacks with tanks that had to be towed by horses or abandoned when their 5-gallon reserves ran dry. The genius of the German officer had been defeated by the most basic law of the industrial age. You cannot fight a machine war without oil. By March 1945, the German war economy was a ghost, haunted by the shadows of its own failed ambitions. The legacy of Hitler's generals is one of professional brilliance, betrayed by moral and strategic cowardice. They were the finest technicians of death the world had ever seen. Yet they failed because they served an ideology that was fundamentally incompatible with reality. They allowed Hitler to dismantle their command structure. They ignored the laws of logistics, and they traded their Prussian honor for the empty promises of a madman. The secret of their failure is a warning for all of history that tactical excellence, when divorced from strategic truth and moral integrity, is nothing more than a decorated path to national suicide. As the Soviet flags were raised over the ruins of Berlin in May 9, the Prussian genius was finally buried under the weight of its own complicity.